It's World Book Day! It's World Book Day, and I heard that it's traditional to come dressed as your favourite character from your favourite book. Well, I got that a bit wrong, and I've come dressed as my favourite book, which is Watership Down. Watership Down by a writer called Richard Adams. And I read this book when I was around your age. And I loved it so much that I read it pretty much every year for quite a few years. I must have read it 20 times. And as you can see, I really got into this book. If you haven't guessed, hello, it's Remy, and this is what I would look like on Facebook. Oh, Facebook. So, I'll take this off. So, Watership Down, my favourite book. It's a really magical adventure story about rabbits, as you might have guessed. And I've read it many, many times, and I've read it to my own daughter, who loves it as well. And this was the book that inspired me to become a writer, to become an author, and to write my own books. That's all about a group of rabbits who go on an adventure across the countryside when their home gets destroyed, and they have to face all sorts of perils on a long journey to find a place where they can build a new, safe warren. Fabulous book. And it inspired me to write this. Yes, my book is called This. It's the first in a series called This, That and the Other. And so far there are 4 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4. So 4 parts. And I'm here today to read a chapter from this. And if you'd like, I'd like to read you my retelling of the Welsh fairy story that was the spark, the story that inspired me to make up this whole story. This is about 2 little girls who become very good friends while they're exploring 3 magical realms: our realm, the realm where the fairies will live, and a third darker realm that get a bit spooky. So would you like me to read you a story from this? Yeah. Okay. Well, as I said, this is a fairy story, my favourite Welsh fairy story, and I've kind of twisted it around a bit and put my own spin on it. But as with all fairy stories, they all start in a good way, don't they? So maybe all together. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, there were 2 young girls, and they were sisters, and they'd been out to the woods to gather nuts and berries, and were on their way home back to the farm where they lived, when they saw in the long grass something that attracted their attention. It was white, looked like white fur, and a little bit of red, and they thought, that looks like a nice warm coat. Now, this is in the olden days, and a coat back then was a prized possession. So if they could find the owner would be very grateful, might even give them a reward. And if they couldn't find the owner, then that coat could keep them warm and cosy on the cold nights. But as they approached to take a closer look, they started to become fearful, because they realized that the white was fur, but the red was blood. And they were a bit worried they may have come across a terrible accident, or something worse. But they were brave little girls, and they took a few steps closer, and they saw that it was a dog. It was a white dog. That's what the white was. It's white fur, and the red was blood. It was obviously injured. And it wasn't just any old dog. It was a very large, noble hunting dog. In those days, just talking to a nobleman, for you or I, the normal folk, just saying hello or talking to a nobleman was not allowed. And touching a nobleman's dog, well, you could be flogged or go to prison or worse. So they thought, it's probably dead anyway, let's leave it and just go home with our nuts and berries. But as they turned to walk away, they heard it whimper, a little pitiful whimper. And they knew they couldn't just walk away and leave it. It needed their help. So they decided they would take it home and try and look after it. It was a big dog, and it wasn't well, so it was very floppy. So it was very difficult for the two little girls to carry. But they were young, strong farm girls, and they were used to doing heavy chores and carrying bundles of firewood and sticks back to the farm. So between them, even though the dog was so floppy and unwell, they managed to carry it, put it down every so often to get their breath back, and then between them they got it back to their farm, and they made a bed of straw close to the fire, a nice soft bed for the dog to lie on. And they went to bed and thought, well, let's see if it's still alive in the morning. The next morning, the dog was still alive. So one of the little girls, even though she was hungry herself, only ate half of her oats, half of her porridge, and then she gave the rest to the dog. She put it down in front of its nose so it could smell it, and it managed to clean the bowl. And the other sister emptied her bowl and filled that with water and put that down in front of the dog, and it drank thirstily. So they were really pleased. It looked like it was getting better. But they also realised that it probably needed something better to eat than porridge if it's going to build up its strength and heal. So after thinking about it, one of the little girls said, our father's fishing line. Let's see if we can catch some fish. You might be wondering where their parents are. Where's their mum and dad? Why are the little girls home alone on an isolated little farm? Well, their parents were away. They'd gone on quite a long walk to the nearest town with their geese to see if they can catch the drovers. Now, the drovers were people who would take usually livestock like sheep and geese very, very long distances from towns into the big cities to be sold at the big markets. And they were usually young boys. So they wanted to catch the drovers at their local village so that the geese could be driven down to the big city. I don't mean driven in a car, not driven like that, and drive a goose. It just meant walking very long distances with the geese. And a lot of the drovers' paths that they used to use became the roads that we do now drive along in cars. So those drovers' routes became our roads that you may even go to school along. And those drovers, the young lads that used to drive the geese down to the city, they used to do something quite strange. They used to put pork fat in their boots. Why? Why would you fill your boots with pork fat? Any ideas? Well, I'm quite a long way away, even though I'm talking to you through this screen, so I can't quite hear what your ideas are. So, shall I tell you? Did they put pork fat in their boots so that along the long journey they'd make friends with all the dogs? It would probably have that effect, I'm sure. I'm sure all the dogs would be following them, smelling the pork fat. That's not why they did it. That's not why they did it. Did they fill their boots with pork fat so that if they got hungry, they could fry their shoes for a snack? Don't think so. Don't think so. Shall I tell you why? Well, their boots would have been big old tough leather boots, and they probably didn't fit too well. And they'd be walking along these paths that weren't roads yet. They're all very muddy and wet and swampy. So fat made the leather waterproof. It softened the leather and it made it waterproof. And also, I don't know if any of you have ever walked a very long way in not shoes that don't fit so well, but they can rub, they can make your feet sore. So filling their shoes with slippery, squishy pork fat meant that the shoes didn't rub as bad, so they could go on these walks for days and days, for hundreds of miles, in boots that were made of tough leather that didn't fit too well, and they wouldn't get blisters. So it made the boots waterproof, stopped them getting blisters, and also helped them make friends with dogs as well, I'm sure. So that's where the two sisters' parents were. They were away taking their geese to market to catch the drovers. So the two little girls took their father's fishing line down to the river, and they managed to catch a fish. A big trout. It was this big. It was this big. Big trout. And they boiled that up in some water, carefully removed all the little fish bones. And even though they were hungry themselves and actually looked quite tasty, they gave all that good meat to the sick dog, who smelt it, licked his lips, and gobbled it down with great gusto, which they were pleased to see. And the girls themselves chopped up some vegetables and put that in the water that they used to boil the fish in, so they had a tasty soup as well, so a tasty vegetable soup. And it wasn't long, with their care and love and attention, that the dog was rewarding them with a wag of the tail and a lick of the hand, and walking about on its own four legs. And they brushed it and got all the mud out of its fur, and they saw that it was indeed a very handsome hound of pure, shining white. And the only bit of colour on it, now the blood had gone and it was all healed up, was a pink nose and a fiery red inside its ears. Apart from that, it was all completely white. And they were playing with it and throwing sticks when they could, but a lot of the time they had chores to do around the farm. They had to clean out the chicken coops, collect the eggs. They had to muck out the pig pen. And the biggest, stinkiest, ickiest job of all was cleaning the cow shed and the cow yard. And sometimes the dog was so interested in what they were doing, it would jump over the fence into the cow yard. And in no time at all, it wouldn't be so clean and gleaming white. It would be an icky, stinky, sludgy brown. Ew! Where it had been rolling in the muck in the cow yard. But that wasn't too much of a problem, because all they do is they take it down to the river and they throw a stick into the water. The dog would jump in a few times until the river water, washed it all clean and white and gleaming and shiny again. So the girls were looking forward to their parents coming home and them being able to tell the story about finding the dog that was injured and nursing it back to health. And one morning they heard the dog barking outside and they thought, oh, "Is this Mum and Dad come back?" And they opened the door, but it wasn't their mum and dad. It was three strangers. Three strangers were just coming into their farmyard. And the dog was barking at them. But it wasn't barking to scare them away, or because the dog was scared. It was wagging its tail and leaping about, and was obviously very, very pleased to see these strangers. Now, they just weren't any old strangers. They were unnaturally tall and thin and very beautiful. And there was a man, the tallest of them was a man, who had long, straight black hair that was so shiny. His long black hair was so shiny that it reflected the sky and looked blue. It was so shiny. And the other two strangers were very beautiful young girls. And one had hair of shining silver, and the other one had hair of pure gold. And their clothes were absolutely immaculate and beautiful, which the girls thought was strange, because the only way to get to their farmyard was along a long, muddy track, and yet these three strangers didn't have one speck of mud on them, and their boots were beautiful and shining. And it didn't take long for the girls to work out that these were no ordinary folk. They were of the Fae. They were fairies. And the tall man bent down and greeted the dog, who licked his hands and was very, very pleased to see him. And the girls knew that the dog had found its rightful owner, and that they'd come to take the dog away. But the stranger introduced himself. He wasn't just any old fairy. He was a fairy prince. And his two companions were his sisters. And they were both fairy princesses. The one with the hair of shining silver and the one with the hair of pure gold. And he explained that it was indeed their hound. And it was a very brave hound that had chased away one of the Coon Anoon. Now, the Coon Anoon are the dogs from the underworld that the king of the underworld uses to hunt. And it had come into their fairy fort to take their livestock. But their hound, their brave hound, had chased it away from their fairy fort and through our realm all the way back to the underworld. But it had obviously been injured in the fight and not managed to make its way home. So the fairies, the prince and the two princesses, were really pleased to see their dog happy and energetic and healthy again and all healed up, and wanted to thank the two little girls for all their effort and their compassion and kindness. How would a fairy thank somebody? Perhaps by granting them a wish. And the fairy prince with the shining black hair stepped forward and said, "Thank you for looking after our hound so well, and to reward your kindness and compassion and for all the care that you've given him, I'd like to grant you a wish. Now, I can smell on the air that your animals need a good clean. How would you like to never have to clean out those chicken coops, or muck out the pig pen, or clean the cow yard and cow shed of all that icky stinky mud and other stuff?" Well, that sounded good, didn't it? And the little girls thought for a moment. Now, they knew that the fairy folk had a reputation for being tricksy and talking in riddles. So they knew they had to think about it and be careful. So they whispered to each other. And after thinking about it for a short while, they said, very politely, "No, thank you." Because they realised that if they never had to clean out the cow shed, or muck out the pig pen, or clear out the chicken coops, that would mean, what would it mean? It means they weren't getting mucky, which meant there were no animals, which meant no food, possible starvation for the two little sisters and their family. So the prince nodded and said, "You are indeed very wise. Perhaps my sisters can offer you a wish to show our thanks." So the princess with the long hair of shining silver stepped forward and said, "I can grant you the wish that you would wish today." And the other princess with the hair of pure gold stepped forward and said, "And I can grant you the wish that you would wish tomorrow." So which would it be? Which wish would they choose? Which wish would you choose? The wish you could wish today, or the wish you could wish tomorrow? You have to think about that one. And that's exactly what the girls did. They thought about it, and they whispered to each other. Well, they say tomorrow never comes. So when would we have the wish we would wish tomorrow? And the other one said, yes, but if we use up our wish today, what if something serious happens tomorrow and we really need the wish? We wouldn't have it anymore. Of course, they wanted to wish they could keep the dog, really, but they could see it was happy with its real owners, so they knew not to wish for themselves and to wish for the dog, really, that he would be happy, but they still couldn't decide whether to wish today or wish tomorrow. Okay, you people, boys and girls, which wish would you wish? The wish today or the wish tomorrow? Well, the girls, should I tell you which one they chose, which wish they chose? After thinking about it, they said, we'll wish tomorrow. And the three fairy folk, the prince and princesses, nodded and said goodbye and walked away. And the dog followed them. The two little girls were sad to see the dog leaving, especially as it didn't pause or look back. That is until it reached the mountains, and just as the dog and the three fairy folk were fading into the sunset, the dog turned round and looked back and gave a bark of gratitude. Now, the next night, around the same time at sunset, the two little girls saw some other people coming down the path towards their farm. Now these two people they recognised. It was their mum and dad. Their parents were coming home. And what a tale their parents had to tell them. They told them that they had got to the local village and to the market, and they had sold the geese for a very good price to the drovers. And they'd been paid by a merchant with a bag of gold coins. And they'd been walking back from the village every day, using all the daylight and sleeping when it got dark. But after a couple of days, they realised, they had the feeling that there was someone following them. And they were a bit worried that somebody back in the village had seen the amount of money they'd been paid and had followed them until they were far enough away from the village that they couldn't get any help. And sure enough, as it was getting dark, they saw 4 bandits. There were 2 ahead of them with knives, and 2 following behind them with axes. Now, the little girl's dad was a very strong farmer, but he could tell that these bandits were not going to ask for the gold nicely, and they were big and they were outnumbered. And as they closed in and raised their axes and brandished their knives, something strange happened. There were 3 other strangers that appeared on the road. And these were not just any old strangers. They were very tall and beautiful and dressed in fine clothes with not one speck of mud upon them. One was a very tall man who had hair that was so black and shining that it looked white because it reflected the moonlight. And there were 2 ladies with him, one with long hair of shining silver and one with long hair of pure gold. And the bandits saw these fine folk and thought, they're worth stealing from. They're obviously very rich, and turned their attention to these 3 strangers that must have appeared out of a local stand of trees or something. They just appeared. But as the bandits turned and raised their weapons, something strange happened. And their faces started to grow long, and they started to shrink, and their hands turned into brown furred paws, and they dropped their weapons, and their feet grew long, and their ears elongated into ridiculously long ears. And as they grew, as their ears and their feet grew, the bandits shrunk, and their clothes fell away from them, until all that was there were 4 rabbits sitting in the piles of clothes. And their noses were twitching, and their eyes were full of fear, because there in front of them was a huge, white, hungry hunting hound. And with a growl and a bark, it chased the rabbits off into the darkness. Now, the little girl's parents were obviously relieved, but when they turned to thank the 3 strangers, there was no one there. They'd gone, and all they could hear was the sound of a distant dog barking as it chased 4 frightened rabbits away into the night. And when their parents told them this story, the 2 girls looked at each other, wished tomorrow. They would have wished for their parents to return home safely. And that's almost the end of the story, except for some time later, almost to the day, a year and a day after they had met the fairy folk, there was a knock. There was a knock at the door, and their father went and opened the door, and the 2 girls could see that there was no one there. But their dad said, "Come and look. Come and look, girls." And they went to the door and looked, and there on their doorstep was a little wickerwork basket lined with straw. And in the basket was a puppy with pure white fur, just a reddish pink nose and fiery red inside its ears. And it looked up at them and wagged its tail as if it already knew them. And that is the end. Apart from to say that the 2 little girls and their family lived happily ever after. And that was a story from this part 1, That Realm, Wherein We Hume Do Dwell, by Remy Dean, which is me. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my story, and I hope you enjoy all the other fun activities that you get up to on World Book Day. Thank you.